Hey biology, so today we're going to go ahead and talk about ecosystems and communities. And before we start getting into both ecosystems and communities, the first thing we need to talk about is basically weather and climate. If you remember, an ecosystem is how organisms interact with each other and with their abiotic and biotic factors. So one abiotic factor that we talk about is climate and weather, because it really shapes the interactions between organisms and each other and organisms and their environment. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and make a Venn diagram describing or comparing and contrasting climate and weather. So when we think about what goes in the center of these, climate and weather, we're thinking about changes in the atmosphere. So it deals with changes in the atmosphere, dealing with pretty much the sun and the chemicals that we find within our air. So when we think of climate, we're thinking about the average conditions that happen over a long period of time within a certain area. Weather is your day-to-day instances or conditions of the atmosphere. So ways to remember this. Well, if you want to remember climate, in examples that we have hot summers, okay, and that's kind of that average condition for our summertime. Weather, though, you would say on this particular day, it's a hot day with maybe pop-up thunderstorms, and so that's the big difference between the two. Okay, so what are some factors affecting the climate? The main source that shapes our climate is going to be solar energy. So some energy is reflected and some is absorbed and converted into heat. And so a lot of times you start hearing about the greenhouse effect. The balance between the heat that stays in the biosphere and the heat that is lost to space determines the average temperature. So Earth's temperature depends largely on three main gases: carbon, methane, and water vapor. These gases are known as our greenhouse gases. So the greenhouse gases function like glass in a greenhouse. Basically, they allow visible light to enter, and they trap heat in through that phenomenon called the greenhouse effect. When concentrations go up, they trap more heat. So the more heat we have, then maybe things like polar ice caps melting happens. And if that happens, we talked about, or we heard Hank talk about how some things are going to be underwater, like New Orleans would be completely underwater. So when concentrations decrease, more heat escapes and Earth begins to cool. So latitude. Latitude, not longitude, basically describes the type of temperatures you're going to see on Earth. So the difference in heat distribution from the sun creates three climate zones. We talk about the tropical, temperate, and polar. So the polar and the temperate zones receive different amounts of solar energy at different times, and that's all of because as Earth rotates around the sun, solar radiation strikes different regions at different angles that vary from summer to winter. Tropical, however, if you notice, is always kind of in the direct line of the sun, and so you're always going to be warmer near the equator. So that unequal distribution of heat basically causes our weather conditions, and it causes convection currents within our atmosphere. So knowing that, hot air is going to rise, cold air sinks, and all of that will cause Earth's winds. And that's just what we see in this picture here. So Earth's rotation causes winds to blow generally from west to east over the temperate zones and from east to west over the polar zones. Is this important for your test? No, but there is a difference, and it does have an effect on communities and the different ecosystems. So now we'll get into ways organisms interact, so the more fun stuff. So remember from chapter 3 that a niche is a place where an organism lives plus the abiotic and biotic factors it interacts with. So when we think of niche, we should be thinking of the job an organism does within its environment. So habitat is basically where an organism lives or their address. Niche is the organism's occupation or job. So tolerance, we talk about that, is basically the organism's ability to survive and reproduce under a certain environmental circumstance. So if in the lower or the upper limit of tolerance, an organism must extend energy to maintain homeostasis. So if you take a look at this graph here, you can see lower limit of tolerance is over to the left, upper limit is over to the right. You always want to be basically where that bell-shaped curve is. Most organisms are in the middle there. That's the optimal range. A species' tolerance for environmental conditions then helps determine its habitat. So you're not going to find things in their lower limit tolerance range or their high limit tolerance range, because it takes a lot more energy to survive in those places. You're always going to kind of find them in that optimum range or optimum range. So there's different ways organisms interact. We have competition, predation, cooperation, and symbiosis, and we'll go ahead and talk about all of those. So what is a resource? So anything an organism needs for life. So an example for that is nutrients, water, light, space, and we touched on that in chapter 3. So competition. So we always compete for those resources that they need. Organisms in an ecosystem have to compete with each other for available resources. So that includes anything like food, shelter, water, and all of that. So there we, again, here's another where we they compete for shelter, compete for mates, compete for space and territory, and so forth. So when we talked about this before, we kind of touched on it. We talked about the competitive exclusion principle. So no two organisms can have the same niche. They can't have the same job within a community. So an example like that, we have these different warbler species. Now they're different species because they don't interbreed. And even though they occupy the same tree, they occupy a different niche because they're in different areas within that tree. So the yellow-rumped warbler is only going to ever occupy the bottom part because of the competition between the bay-breasted warbler and the Cape May warbler. So in competition, plants also compete for light. And then we get into predation. So between different kinds of organisms, hunt and kill other organisms to supply their energy needs. Predation. Organisms in an ecosystem that capture and eat other organisms to supply their energy needs. So basically what I just stated earlier. So these are just examples of predation. So when we talk about interdependence, or when you hear that, we basically think about how all living things affect each other. And we're actually going to do an activity later on in this chapter where we've done it before, where some of you will be deer, some of you will be resources. Well, when one population changes, it then starts to have an effect on another population. So all living and non-living things in an ecosystem are interconnected, and changing even one thing impacts the whole ecosystem. So one quote that I like, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it's attached to the rest of the world. And that's kind of the idea of interdependence and how everything is kind of connected to each other. So again, competing for resources. If resources are scarce, some organisms will starve and a population will decrease. If resources become plentiful, populations will increase. So competition in nature often results in a winner and a loser, with the loser failing to survive. So if a nutrient is in short supply or cycles slowly, it will limit the growth of a population, and we call that the limiting factor. So obviously the limiting factor here is water, and so this drought causes these kangaroos here to pretty much run out of food and run out of water, and then they starve and they die. An example of something that we see in our book is the moose and wolf population at the Isle Royale, and they actually do studies at the Isle Royale, and that's I believe in Michigan. It's a little isle there in Michigan, and it's off of Lake Michigan, where they study the different population of moose and wolves. And you see, as like one population changes, you can kind of see how it affects another population. So increase in prey means more food for predators. If there's more food for predators, it's likely that they survive and reproduce. And then the cycle kind of just always repeats itself. If there's too many predators, not enough prey, then the wolf population decreases, and it changes then what the moose population will look like later. So they're all pretty much connected. So remember, everything is connected, and one thing will affect another. So organisms also cooperate with each other. So between same kind of organisms live together and they help each other. So here's some examples of cooperation. So some species live together in groups, herds, packs, colonies, families, etc. They share food, they share child care responsibilities, groom each other, take care of the sick. So some organisms hunt in packs. They also stay together to provide protection for each other. Then we start talking about symbiosis. So symbiosis happens between different kinds of organisms that live in close association to one another. So we have 3 different types of symbiosis. You need to know the 3 different types. Let's make sure that in our notes we write down these 3 different types and then write down examples of the 3 different types of symbiosis. So the first one, we have mutualism. Both organisms benefit. So it's a mutual relationship. It's beneficial there. The next one, we have commensalism. One organism benefits, the other is neither harmed nor helped. And then the last one is parasitism, one that I'm sure you already know about. One organism benefits, the other one is harmed in some way. So mutualism, it's good for you. What's good for me is good for you. Birds eat parasites off the hides of giraffes and rhinos. They get the protection from the giraffes and rhinos, and basically the giraffes and rhinos get groomed. So both of them, they benefit from this relationship. Another example of mutualism, insects transfer pollen between plants as they gather nectar for food, whereas they get food, the plants then transfer pollen. So we all know Nemo, and the clownfish gets protection from the anemones by hiding out in the poisonous anemones. The anemones get to scrape over the leftover food dropped by the fish, and Nemo, they get protection. Another example of commensalism is these pilot fish that basically receive the scraps of food dropped by a shark. A shark is neither harmed nor helped, so we consider it commensalism. Sorry, not mutualism. So this is commensalism. So good for me, doesn't bother you. Hermit crabs make homes and shells of abandoned snails. The snail is not harmed by the crab. The snail ditched the shell a long time ago, but the crab benefits from it. Parasitism. This one's actually not parasitism. This is a bad example. Barnacles are crustaceans that attach themselves to the whales. Now, barnacles feed on the fluids outside of the whale. The whale's not necessarily harmed, so this actually should be changed. So the whale's not harmed, but barnacles live on it and basically collect food. So this wouldn't be a good example of parasitism. It would be a good example of commensalism. Here is one though, ticks, which we actually are seeing a lot about lately because ticks are starting to carry some viruses that can really harm, Lyme disease is one, that can really harm your animals or you in general. So ticks feed on the dog's blood. The dog has discomfort, it can get diseases from infected bites. It would be considered a parasite. These right here, tapeworms. Tapeworms absorb food by living inside of a host's intestine. The host is harmed, the worm grows. Now, you hear some instances of these, like the way usually young kids or animals get tapeworms. So babies, babies, they'll dig in dirt, they'll go ahead and they'll put their hands in their mouths. Well, tapeworms, they'll lay eggs in that dirt, and then when the babies stick their hands in their mouths, the eggs go into the intestine, and then they grow from there. And basically, people that have tapeworms, they're always hungry, and then when they're ready, basically, the tapeworms will detach, and you pass them in your stool. And you can actually look up instances where some tapeworms have gotten to like extreme lengths. It's pretty disgusting, but basically it absorbs the food that you're supposed to be getting, and it absorbs the nutrients you're getting, so it's considered a parasite. Alright, so that is it for chapter 1 and 4.1 and 4.2.